be reported through stenographic means and through the broadcast on the web TV of the Chamber of Deputies. I would like to say that colleagues can participate remotely according to the modalities established by the regulation. Today we will be speaking and carrying out a fact-finding exercise thanks to the audition of Vina Nadjibulla, excuse me the pronunciation, Deputy President of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. I'd like to thank her for having accepted our invitation, who is in video conference. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Canadian Embassy in Rome, which made this important hearing possible. I'd like to recall that the Asia-Pacific Foundation is one of the most accredited and well-known institutes that studies topics connected to Indo-Pacific. It was set up in 1984 because Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau wished to establish and undertake a program to strengthen the role of Canada in the Pacific region. This hearing is particularly important because for our fact-finding exercise, which is about to be concluded. We have examined the different situations in the Indo-Pacific according to different perspectives and viewpoints, not just from a political but also from a geographical perspective. The fact that a friendly state of Italy, which borders on the Pacific and which has particularly close relations with the US, is of particular interest to us. Let me recall that the Canadian strategy very clearly sees China as a disruptive global power that like-minded countries must face in a coordinated manner. I'd like to give the floor immediately to Ms. Nadjibulla for her contribution. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning from Vancouver and good afternoon to all of you. It is an honor to be able to testify before this committee. Thank you very much for the invitation. I apologize for not speaking Italian, and I think there's a bit of a technical issue, so let me try to fix that. But thank you so much for making this available in English for me to be able to share some perspectives from the Canadian experience in the Indo-Pacific, and of course the Asia-Pacific Foundation, where I work as the Vice President, is an independent, non-governmental organization, so the views are not of the Government of Canada. This is a civil society perspective. I will share some thoughts, and I very much hope that I can engage in your questions and provide something that's most relevant to this committee for your investigation. As the chair noted, Canada has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Like many other countries, Canada recognizes the significance of this region geopolitically, as well as from an economic perspective for Canada's prosperity and stability. We adopted the strategy 2 years ago, so I will briefly mention what the strategy contains, what are some of the lessons that we've already seen that might be of interest to you, but then also speak to the unique dimensions for Canada, which is our North American position and the relationship with the US. Now, while all G7 countries and like-minded Western democracies face similar challenges and also similar opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, there are three elements to Canada which I think are worth mentioning. One is, of course, we are a Pacific nation. As much as Canada has always focused on its Euro-Atlantic relationship through NATO, we do have a large Pacific coast and have significant interests in the region. So we are in the Indo-Pacific and see ourselves as a Pacific nation. Secondly, we're also a North American nation, and as such, our relationship with the US is the most important, both from a security as well as economic. So anything that we do in the region has to be closely coordinated with the US. And usually about 90% of the time interests align, but there are some challenges or moments where that's not the case. And I think we can speak to that more also during your questions period. And then the final element is the diaspora element. Canada is a multicultural society. We have very large diaspora from the region. So particularly this is relevant in the case of India, as well as China, but also other parts of the Indo-Pacific. And our foreign policy and engagement with some of those key countries has been shaped by domestic considerations. And again, we can speak more to that. So those are kind of framing questions. Canada developed the strategy and released it in 2022 after several years of consultation for two main reasons. One was to deal with China, because as you may recall, we had a major diplomatic crisis with China that began in 2018 and ended in 2021. So China was kind of the big question that the government was trying to wrestle with at the time. And then the second element is, again, recognizing that the region itself is more important. So not just China, but also Southeast Asian countries, as well as North Pacific countries, which for us means Japan and South Korea primarily, are important and need to be dealt with outside of China. So the strategy tries to do both of those things. It has a very large section on China that for the first time lays out how Canada sees China as a global power, both opportunities and significantly challenges of that, strategic challenges of that. But it also tries to say that there are other relationships in the region, notably North Pacific, which is a concept introduced in the strategy, as well as Southeast Asia or ASEAN, that are critical. Even 2 years ago, when the strategy was first presented, the section on the Indo part was a little bit more limited. And the discussions on India, of course, have taken a very different turn than was noted in the strategy in the last 18 months. The strategy notes India as a critical partner in the region, but of course, our relations have really been very much strained. And again, we can talk about that in the question and answer. The strategy is a whole of government strategy, which I think is well in that it has 17 different departments in government that have contributed to it. So that's a positive. It also has a budget attached to it, which is also positive and different from many other strategies that have been developed, including the ones in Europe, in France, Germany, and others. So there's $2.3 billion Canadian that was allocated to the strategy for the first 5 years. It has many specific programs that have been outlined in an annex to the strategy, which is also important and was an innovation for Canada. So when I say it's whole of government, that's of course a positive development. But now, since its launch 2 years ago, the government is also trying to make it a whole of society strategy, in that they're engaging with civil society, with businesses, as well as provincial governments, because Canada is has a federal system, so provincial governments play an important role as well. So there is an effort to make it whole of society. When the strategy was developed 2 years ago, it was the first of its kind. Canada does not have a strong tradition of having publicly available foreign policy strategies or national security strategies. In fact, we haven't developed one of those in more than 20 years. So in some ways, we developed a regional strategy in the absence of an overall foreign policy strategy or a national security strategy. So that has been a challenge. But since then, what the government is trying to do is to link our approach to the Indo-Pacific with our approach to the Arctic in particular, through the defense policy update, which came out earlier this year, as well as trying to make linkages of how Canada is positioning itself in the Atlantic through our NATO engagement with our priorities in the Indo-Pacific. So I guess the lesson here is that while it's important to look at the region and the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, it's also necessary to link that to ongoing work, in Canada's case, in the Arctic as well as Euro-Atlantic. This is also a recognition that we have limited resources as a country. I mean, of course, we're a G7 country like Italy, but nonetheless, there are limited resources. And even though the strategy had 2.3 billion attached to it, it's still not enough given the challenges of the region. So there's a big tension and debates now in Canada in the policy community about how do we prioritize what we need to do in the Arctic, given that that is a huge area for Canada and also an area where we can play a leadership role. How do we maintain our commitments through NATO, particularly given the situation in Ukraine, the illegal invasion, and Canada has played an active role there? And how do we continue to have a meaningful presence in the Indo-Pacific? Now, so that's again by way of context. In terms of the strategy's actual pillars and what's in the strategy, let me say a word about that. So it has 5 main pillars. Looks at the peace and security and resilience as first pillar, which is important. Then it looks obviously at economic and trade investment as well as supply chain resilience. Third issue is people-to-people relations, which again is unique to Canada given our large diaspora community and the importance of cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, business exchange. And then the fourth pillar is on sustainability. So recognizing that Canada plays and wants to play more of a role in energy security and partnerships with the region on everything from LNG, liquid natural gas, to nuclear energy, to renewable energy, and a green technology and transition. So that's a fourth pillar. And the final pillar is more about improving Canada's presence and diplomacy in the region. So this is an interesting thing. And again, a lesson perhaps, or something to consider is that the strategy recognizes that in order for Canada to be more effective in the region, we need to increase our actual presence, diplomatic footprint in the region. So, and one of the successes since the launch of the strategy 2 years ago has been opening of new offices. So we've opened, for instance, an office in Manila, Philippines that looks at agriculture. So it's because Canada, again, has a strong relationship when it comes to food security and selling of agricultural commodities in the region, as well as innovation in climate smart agriculture, so linking sustainability as well as food security agenda. We now have a dedicated government office in Manila that's going to work with Southeast Asia generally on that. Similarly, we've increased our presence, for instance, through cybersecurity attaches, again, recognizing that Canada has something to offer to the region on cybersecurity, and the region is interested in that. So that's a dedicated presence. We've also increased our defense attaché presence in the region. We've put in people who are looking at China, diplomats who are looking at China, but are located in Northeast Asia or in Southeast Asia. So kind of increasing our China competence by putting dedicated personnel in our Asian embassies that are, again, looking at China from outside in, if you will. So not just having presence in Beijing and across China, but also looking at China's influence in the region. So I think that enhancement of capacity, government capacity in the region has been important. In addition to that, it's been increasing presence of other partners, including our own foundation. Asia-Pacific Foundation now will have an office in Singapore and be doing work in the region directly rather than only looking at Asia from Canada. Same for a number of other entities, business chambers, expert development entities. So that enhancement of presence, both from government and other sectors, has been a big element of the strategy. So I would say that kind of in terms of what the strategy is trying to achieve, it's trying to enhance our presence, it's putting in more people on the ground, and it's building partnerships, especially with key organizations like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We became a strategic partner to ASEAN 2 years ago. There's a lot more engagement at that institutional level. So that's on all of the things that sort of the strategy has gotten right, at least from our perspective at the foundation. Now, there's still many challenges. In the case of Canada, even though we are a Pacific nation, we have that's at least by geography, the reputation that Canada has on the ground in the region, especially in places like Southeast Asia, is a little bit more mixed because we have been present in the past, then we withdrew our attention, now we're back. So the idea that we want to be a reliable partner still needs to gain some momentum on the ground. It still needs to be something that stakeholders on the ground actually believe and trust and want to engage in. The second element of challenge, which is limited resources, especially when it comes to peace and security, defense presence, and making a case that Canada has a stake in the peace and stability of the region. For Canada, it's been much easier to engage on the economic elements. We, as a trading nation, over 60% of our GDP comes from trade. We are very much a believer still in free and rules-based trade. So our economic engagement in the region is quite robust, and I can speak a little bit more to that, including through the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is a regional trade agreement, as well as a number of free trade agreements in the region, which we are also now signing as part of the strategy, notably with Indonesia and with ASEAN. So on the economic side, I think we have a good track record. But when it comes to being seen as a player on peace and defense, it's more challenging, partly because, again, of limited capacity, limited resources. But it's something that we need to do more of and in a smarter way in order to be able to be seen as a strategic partner rather than just as a partner who's interested in economic and trade relations. Because, again, these countries, notably in Southeast Asia, want more than just trade. They also want a partner when it comes to managing issues like the tensions in South China Sea, potential contingencies around Taiwan, and other difficulties in the region. U.S., of course, does that much more, and so it's something that we notice a difference in our relations. Now, I had earlier mentioned that we have some challenges in our key bilateral relationships in the region. I think that's important to note as well, that the strategy now, particularly when it comes to India, seems a little bit outdated. So that's something also to consider, that strategies are important to have, but they have to be living documents and they have to adjust the challenges, given that in the current context, things change so quickly. So our relationship with India, like I said, is very different than what was envisaged in the strategy. And that's something that certainly our foundation finds as a challenge. With respect to China, this has been sort of, like I said, a big part of the strategy. Some things have changed since the strategy came out 2 years ago, but I think the overall relationship still remains quite tense. And while we have an economic relationship, on the overall bilateral relationship, our position on China is probably much closer to the US than many others, including in Europe. A key part of that now is going to be the economic security agenda, a concept that's not very present in the strategy, which is, again, shows how the document needs to be a living document. In the strategy, there's a lot more focus on resilience as a concept, so supply chain resilience, economic resilience, whereas the conversation in the last 2 years has moved a little bit more towards economic security, both in the G7 discussions because of Japan's leadership, but also because of the US administration's agenda on economic security and on de-risking from China. So I think that's something that is being now carried out outside of the strategy. The government of Canada had consultations on economic security, and we're trying to figure out how to balance the desire to engage in trade and have free and open trade as much as possible with the need to balance our own national security interests, as well as to manage our relationship with the US. Because as you saw with the examples of tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, Canada had to follow exactly what the US did. So we put in place 100% tariffs, which was different than what happened in the European Union context, where there were long debates, desire to follow rules-based requirements of WTO and so forth. In the Canadian context, we essentially followed the US. So there are now questions in terms of how do we manage the agenda for trade and economic integration, especially with Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, with our very strong integration into the US economy through NAFTA, through the North American agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada. So those are some issues to consider as well. I'm cognizant that I'm probably speaking quite a bit, and I'm hoping that the interpretation is staying steady, but maybe if I can stop there to see if there are any early questions just to help me guide what I say next, I would appreciate that. Over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Grazie mille, ci ha dato un quadro molto...
Thank you very much. You have provided us with a very detailed picture. To begin with, Member of Parliament Billy signed up to ask you a question, but first I would like to ask you a couple of questions myself. Number one, this refers to a doubt that came to mind because during my college years, I delved into the establishment of the province of Nunavut, and therefore the importance within the institutional and political Canadian system of the First Nation or First Nations, plural. In other areas of the globe, we have seen that these minorities, native peoples, let's call them whatever way you please, well, they were used, or the attempt was made for foreign powers to use them. And I would like to refer to the Canucks in New Caledonia. First, they were approached by China and then even by Azerbaijan. Do you see a similar risk in Canada emerging? Because this would refer to the narrative of the so-called global South against a West that wants to crush the South, like the Western countries with their double standards and double narratives, which actually want to impose a new kind of colonialism. We know that this is not the case at all. Actually, we are here to fight for freedom of navigation and the rule of law and preserve global peace. We are not here to incite division or geopolitical disruptions. So this was the first question. The second one, instead, refers to the fact that Canada, a couple of years ago, adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy, being an Indo-Pacific country. As you have very effectively described to us, it's a living document, you said, which gradually evolves and adjusts to the changing context and actually changes at breakneck speed. Our instead continent and specific European countries, Germany, France is an Indo-Pacific country, the UK, they do not have a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And the ambition of our Commission, at least our initial ambition, was that the following. In discussing Indo-Pacific issues for the first time in the Italian Parliament, we wanted to then contribute to developing an Italian vision and strategy for the Indo-Pacific. Based on your experience, the Canadian model, is it more useful to have a codified or encoded strategic vision which evolves over time, like you mentioned, or instead it would be smarter not to have this kind of approach? And I would like now to give the floor to my colleague, Member of Parliament Billy. Thank you. I would like to thank our speaker for her willingness to speak to us. And I would like to go back to what you were saying earlier, Chairman Formentini. I would like to ask our speaker, based on her experience and from your vantage point, well, our country, Italy, how do you think that our country can cooperate with your country, Canada, in the Indo-Pacific? How can our two countries work better together in this region of the globe? Thank you.
Prego, a lei la parola per la replica.
You have the floor for your answers. Thank you.
much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for those questions, members of the committee. I will maybe start with your two questions, Chair. First of all, on the idea of Indo-Pacific strategy and whether it would be helpful for Italy as a European power to have a publicly available articulation of its vision for the Indo-Pacific. My answer would be yes. I think on balance, given that it may not be obvious that Italy should be interested in the region because of geography. Of course, you are located in a different region and have priorities when it comes to the Mediterranean and even what's happening in West Indian Ocean. But nonetheless, I think there needs to be recognition, and I think that recognition now exists, even by the fact that you're having this investigation, that the center of global power and economic dynamism is shifting to the Indo-Pacific region. This is the region that is going to have quite a bit of impact on prosperity, global prosperity, as well as European prosperity, but it's also a region that now represents a number of challenges to the US-led Western international liberal order that we, Italy and Canada and others, have come to enjoy and benefit from over the last 70 years. I think the rise of China already and the rise of India that is happening now, as well as the importance that countries like Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world, will play in global affairs, I think is important to recognize. So there are both opportunities and strategic challenges that emanate from this region. And it's important for a G7 nation like Italy to have a vision that articulates how you view the region, how you want to advance your national interests together with an overall European vision for the region. I think European framework for engagement with the Indo-Pacific is a good start, but it very heavily prioritizes economic issues, which is understandable, cooperation issues, which is understandable, but there might be some unique set of items that Italy can explore and would be helpful. I think it's also useful to have a strategy to be able to show that while key countries like China are important and have until recently dominated discussions about the Indo-Pacific, that the region is broader and more complicated than that. Southeast Asia, as well as India, as well as relations with Japan and South Korea also need to be considered. So that, I would note that. Having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that the Indo-Pacific is a very large place. Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy defines the boundaries to include 40 countries. We do not include East African states as part of the West Indian Ocean, but some other governments and countries do include those. So I think you'll also have to look at geography, what exactly is your definition of the Indo-Pacific according to your interests. But then within that, once you define that, to look into where in the region you will put your priorities. So in the case of Canada, we are choosing to prioritize the North Pacific, which is Japan, South Korea, because of the connection to the Arctic and our geography, as well as Southeast Asia because of economic complementarity. So we're recognizing that given our economy, which is focused on energy and food, that Southeast Asia, which has a growing need for both of those things, could be an area of complementarity. So I think making those 2 points would be important. With respect to your question, Chair, on the First Nations, Indigenous peoples, it's a very good question, and you're absolutely right that Canada, in addition to having a whole of Canada approach from federal government, provincial governments, whole of society, also needs to consider the interest and the stake of First Nations, which in the Canadian context have sovereignty, including over land that's extremely rich in natural resources, critical minerals, and other things, which are a big part of our strategy and our engagement with the region, particularly with Japan, with Korea, as well as China. And China in recent years has been taking advantage of this element of Canadian context and the fact that First Nations have sovereignty and can manage their own affairs. So China has been approaching those groups directly, especially in the Canadian North, which is a very large territory, and has been making economic deals, offering economic infrastructure investments, which the region desperately needs as a way to gain influence and to gain a foothold. It's an issue that's very much current. It's happening right now. The strategy that we developed and released 2 years ago does not really speak to that issue. So it's one of the weaknesses of the strategy and something that we now need to be addressing through other channels, including our Arctic strategy, which the Canadian government will be releasing in the next few weeks. It's an important issue, and you're absolutely right that China uses overt information campaigns around global South, solidarity with people, colonial narratives, but they're also using disinformation and covert influence operations, as well as bribery, corruption, all of the things that are part of the foreign interference toolkit, especially with the Canadian diaspora community and First Nations communities in the North. But it's a challenge that now is recognized, and the way to deal with it, I think, is to really bring those groups, First Nation communities, into the discussion in Canada. They need to be at the table when we speak about our Indo-Pacific strategy. They used to be at the table when we spoke about our Arctic strategy, but I think even with the Indo-Pacific strategy, given China's approach to dealing with those communities, we need to now have them at the table. Now, in terms of the final question on cooperation between Italy and Canada, I think that is a very good question, and we certainly see a lot of opportunities. That's in part why I was very excited to have this chance to engage with your committee. And of course, we work very closely with the Italian embassy and consulates here in Vancouver as well. So, as a fellow G7 country, I think that's one area where we can do more together. Of course, in 2025, Canada will have the chair, and Indo-Pacific will need to be on the agenda. Now, for the last few years, issues of China, Indo-Pacific, what's happening between Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and the war in Ukraine, those issues are all coming in and showing the linkages between the two theaters, the kind of the NATO theater as well as the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's some natural complementarities there at the strategic level for Canada and Italy to work together, especially in a context where the US may now be a less predictable partner, or a partner that will require a lot more diplomatic consideration and a lot more coordination among middle powers or other liberal democracies like Italy, like Japan, like UK. So there's a level of strategic coordination. On the economic issues, I would say that, again, there's some things that Canada is doing in the region from which we could benefit in trilateral partnerships. So, for instance, exploring ways in which Italy and Canada can partner in the region, in Southeast Asia or in India, even though, for instance, Canada has difficult diplomatic relations with India, our economic relations are still continuing. Canadian pension funds are very big investors in infrastructure in Italy. Also, our businesses are quite active. So I think there are opportunities for trilateral cooperation when it comes to economic issues. And then a final point I would note is we've seen that UK recently joined the CPTPP, which is an important regional trade bloc in the Indo-Pacific. It's an important, now the CPTPP has kind of gone global or gone outside of the Pacific region. That might be something also for Italy to look into, as it's a very high quality agreement which gives access to that part of the world to Italy. I will stop my comments there, Chair, and give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Grazie mille per le risposte puntualissime.
Thank you for the very specific replies you have provided. And our colleague, Member of Parliament Carré, just joined us. Not only he's one of our colleagues, but actually he actually breathes in Indo-Pacific and lives out the Indo-Pacific because he hails from Australia. He comes from the enormous Italian diaspora throughout the world, and the diaspora, of course, elects its own members of parliaments. And so I would like to give the floor to Mr. Carré. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank also our speaker, and I apologize for being late, actually, because this is a topic that's very close to my heart. Because all the reasons the Chair mentioned. Actually, I've lived in Australia for more than 40 years, and now I'm here, of course, and I'm a member of the committee of the Italian delegation to NATO, together with our chair, Mr. Formentini. We really care about this topic, the Indo-Pacific. I believe that the Indo-Pacific, and you explained this very effectively, there is a common denominator between the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. In the Arctic, there are 8 countries, out of which 7 are NATO members. So they're supposed to have a defense strategy that is coordinated for the Arctic. The strategy also on, let's say, shipping lines of communications, because this is on the Arctic, the ice cap is melting. Our scientists are telling us about this, and the new route will open up, and the Chinese are very eager to take advantage of this. They would actually join this group of nations that share a border with the Arctic Sea. And then the Indo-Pacific, extremely important. There too, there is a major struggle playing out when it comes to trade, but also the control of trade. And also the raw materials for microprocessors. We know that China, rare earth materials, for instance, and China is looking at Taiwan very closely, and Taiwan is the holder of very important technologies, not just for Europe, but also for the United States. Now, pouring through several reports, looking at analytical data and political reports, both from Europe and the United States, then we realize that the United States, to some extent, are moving their gaze away from Eastern Europe. They're flying over the Mediterranean Sea, and they're now focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. This focus has led to a partnership agreement through the Quad, Japan, India, UK, and the United States, and also the partnership agreement they signed with Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia. All this, basically, to set up a deterrence program or system to make sure that China does not really occupy, do not exert their very powerful influence on that part of the Indo-Pacific region. And Italy, as you have rightly mentioned earlier, is now also for the very first time is looking into introducing a direct policy on Indo-Pacific, common defense with other countries, internationalization, etc. My question for you is simply the following. Do you believe that this greater focus that the United States are having on the Indo-Pacific region is due not only to the fact that they want to basically nip in the bud the territorial ambitions of China, but also to block in some way control that China might exert on trade if this new route through the Arctic then opens up because of the ice caps melting? And if this is the case, then the 7 countries that belong to the Arctic Club and that belong to NATO as well, do you think that they can come up with a coordinated strategy so that there too, this route to some extent can be, well, if not controlled, but at least, it can be detoured towards the parliamentary democracies that we care so much about? I would like to thank Mr. Carré because he was able to link together the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific. I would like also to inform you that the next target that we're going to have with the Foreign Affairs Commission after looking into the Indo-Pacific, we will also focus on the Arctic. Starting from January, and we might be knocking on your door again if you allow us to do so, to focus on the Arctic. And I would like to give you the floor at this point for your reply.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Carré, for that very thoughtful question and for making linkages between the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. Now, let me say a couple of words to your broader points around the strategy that the U.S. is putting in place in the region around deterrence of China and balancing of China's ambitions when it comes to South China Sea in particular, China's threats of unification with Taiwan, as well as greater partnership that we're now seeing between China, Russia, and North Korea. So I think you're absolutely right that a key element of the U.S. approach, as well as perhaps Japan, Australia, and even India, has been around deterrence and balancing. And for countries like Italy and Canada and maybe others in the EU, it's important to find an accommodation and a balance in our Indo-Pacific strategies for this kind of deterrence agenda that the U.S. is putting forward, which I think we also share, as well as the economic engagement agenda, which underpins our desire for greater economic trade with parts of that region. So I think, and there are some tensions in these two agendas, and we saw them under the Biden administration being managed in a particular way through a lot of diplomacy, a lot of coordination with the allies, the launching of many mini-laterals that you mentioned, the Quad between Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S., the Squad that brings Philippines into that same alignment. So I think that was a very good way of managing that the Biden administration was putting forward. There are now questions as to how the new U.S. administration will manage that agenda and whether they'll be as friendly or as considerate towards allies and partners in the region. So I think that's something to watch, and it's important for Canada, Italy, other members of the G7, which links us to the earlier question of partnership between Canada and Italy, to push for that, to maintain that kind of allied cooperative approach, rather than maybe a U.S. first approach that only worries about deterring China, but misses other elements which are important to liberal democracies in the region, but also to other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and others that need to balance U.S. Western interests with the China's reality, because China is the most important economic player in the region for them. So that's on the deterrence. And I think Canada, of course, has had some challenges in managing that. I think whatever strategy, whatever vision Italy puts out there would need to find the right balance between a deterrence agenda and an economic engagement agenda, which balances this kind of peace and prosperity part of the whole strategy. Now, on the issue of kind of China's ambitions, not just in South China Sea, which is well documented, but also to the north, I think that's a very important point. And of course, those discussions have changed quite significantly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I have spent a lot of time studying Russia and Soviet Union and Soviet and China relations. And I would say that what we're seeing in the last 2-3 years has been remarkable in the way the relationship between Russia and China are changing, which also means in the way that China now has access and influence over Russian territory to the north. Because China, even though it claims to be a near Arctic state, of course, is not an Arctic state. The geography is obvious. but it now has a lot more leverage over Russia because Russia is much more dependent on China than it's ever been, and is able to advance its economic but also military and scientific objectives in Russia's north, in Siberia. So that, of course, has ramifications for Canada as a major Arctic state, but also for NATO and Western Alliance, because again, of all the things you've mentioned, including recent sabotage by China of undersea cables, I believe that that's just the beginning. We will be seeing more of that, more joint actions on the part of Russia and China, military exercise in the Bering Sea in the north, close to Alaska, but also close to the Arctic. And we need obviously an allied NATO response to that. And as you mentioned, everyone apart from Russia now are in the NATO, but it's also important to bring in our Indo-Pacific partners. So Japan and South Korea also need to be in this conversation. They have a lot to offer. For example, when it comes to building submarines or being able to have access to the region through Canada, US, even Finland and other countries are limited. South Korea has a lot to offer here. So that's something that we are exploring and it's something to consider. So whatever response democracies come up with to the new challenge of China and Russia in the Arctic, in our view, also has to include key Pacific part, because again, geography, it's not just the Atlantic side. You also need Korea, Japan to be in this discussion as well. So I would put that on the table, and it's part of linking your Indo-Pacific agenda with your discussions of the Arctic in January. Thank you very much, Chair.
Grazie davvero, è stata un'audizione.
Thank you very, very much. This has been a very, very interesting exchange for us, and we hope we will see you again when we will be speaking about the Arctic. Once again, we'd like to thank you, and this is the end of our hearing.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Molte.